This is CR Change Request. From the Sunday Desk, your structural brief for the week ending Sunday, June 7th, 2026. This week's read covers 10 signals across 4 layers: the federal policy gate, the classification gate, the movement and exposure gate, and the private systems gate. This week is about access. Not access as a feeling, access as architecture. Who gets funded? Who gets covered? Who gets investigated? Who gets hired? Who gets to move? And increasingly, who gets filtered before anyone has to explain the decision? That is the part worth holding. The gate moved. Some gates moved because someone in office signed an order, issued a rule, or rewrote the funding terms. Those gates still leave a signature. Others move through private systems, hiring engines, data brokers, screening vendors, commercial location trails. Those gates are harder to see, harder to challenge, and much easier to mistake for neutrality. Hold that distinction for the full read. It is the spine of the week. We'll start where the heaviest machinery sits, at the federal policy level, with the money itself. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB, proposed a rewrite this week of the rules that govern federal financial assistance, the standards behind how grants get administered across the entire government, posted at the end of May with a 45-day comment window. The public-facing language is the familiar vocabulary: transparency, accountability, oversight, and on its face, who argues with accountability? That is usually where the second read begins. Federal grants do not only fund programs, they shape what gets studied, what gets staffed, what gets protected, and what survives. Change the review layer and you change the public value the money was supposed to produce. So this is not a grant story. It is a public value control story. The grant application stops being a funding request and becomes a test of institutional acceptability. You already know this play if you have ever watched funding turn into a filter. Money has always shaped behavior. What is new is that the conditions are migrating from what you do with the money toward who you are before the money ever arrives. Where it lands locally is the part to hold. The chill does not wait for a denial. A researcher, a university office, a small nonprofit that lives on these dollars starts writing toward what they believe will pass review. They soften a study, they drop a population, they change a word. Nobody told them to. That is how a control system works at its most efficient. It never has to say no because people start saying it to themselves. So if you operate inside federal funding, the evidence will show up in the fine print. Follow the review criteria as they get rewritten. The priority alignment language, the termination authority, the award discretion, and the renewal standards, because that is where the discretion actually lives. And follow the tell that arrives before any funding decision does. The moment applications in your sector start using the new vocabulary on their own. When the language shifts before the money does, the gate has already moved. Now look at the people who administer that money. Days after that grant proposal, an executive order landed that makes it far easier to dismiss roughly 8,000 senior federal workers, the ones whose jobs involve shaping government policy, by stripping the job protections that used to sit around those roles. Reporting this week put the potential reach much higher, up to 50,000 workers if it expands, though the current action centers on that first group. The official story is accountability in government employment. The sharper read is who these people actually are. These are the kinds of senior career roles that shape rules, review risk, steward research dollars, evaluate programs, and slow decisions down when the evidence demands it. Think CDC epidemiologists, FDA medical reviewers, NIH program officers, and the people who know where the policy bodies are buried. Through what is known as schedule policy/career reclassification, those roles become easier to remove. And when the people administering the gate become easier to remove, the gate starts answering before the next order is ever issued. The play is older than the headline. Civil service exists precisely so that expertise does not get fired for telling power something it does not want to hear. Strip that protection, and you have not only changed who can be removed, you have changed who can safely ask a question before a rule is written, before a drug is cleared, before the money moves. If you have ever sat inside an institution, you know the first thing to disappear is not always the person. Sometimes it is the question nobody feels safe asking anymore. You will not see that in a press release. You will see it later, in the decision that should have been challenged and was not. So the evidence here is behavioral. Operators should follow agency turnover and who leaves, the internal review standards as they loosen, the regulatory drafting, the grant scoring, and whether career officials begin narrowing their decisions around political risk instead of the merits. The governing structure will not announce this. It shows up as a slow narrowing of dissent inside the rooms where the rules get made. One signal changes how the money moves. This one changes who is allowed to slow it down. And once the people and the money are in motion, the next question is what the government counts as need. The federal homelessness count landed this week. On a single night in January 2025, roughly 745,000 people experiencing homelessness, more than 266,000 of them unsheltered. The framing carried two numbers at once, a 3% decrease from the year before and a 27% increase since 2013, with the long-term rise tied explicitly to a decade of the housing first approach. The headline wants this to be about a number going down. But 3 days later, a $4 billion funding notice followed, restructured around recovery, self-sufficiency, supportive services, transitional housing, competition, and performance. So what the count is really doing is governing the measurement itself. The story is not that homelessness went down. It is that the count immediately walked into a fight over which model gets blamed, which model gets funded, and which timeline becomes the official explanation. A one-year decline supports one argument. A decade-long climb supports another. Both can be true at once. The power sits in which frame becomes policy and then becomes money. One of the hats I wear is real estate consultant, so I cannot read a homelessness count like it is just a number on a federal PDF. Housing is not abstract from where I sit. I watch affordability, rental pressure, displacement risk, inventory, and buyer readiness move together in real neighborhoods. So when the count shifts, I do not only ask whether it went up or down. I ask what the count is about to be used to justify. Because housing does not begin collapsing at the point of homelessness. It weakens all the way up the ladder first, in rent burden, eviction risk, voucher access, shrinking affordable inventory, and the widening gap between what people earn and what it costs to stay housed. Watch the order. First, the structure produces a number. Then the number becomes a mandate. Then the mandate becomes a funding shift. The measurement is never only measurement. It is the opening move. So for the continuums of care, the providers, the cities, the housing advocates, and the real estate operators reading this, The tell will be the timeline. Follow which one becomes policy, the 1-year decline or the decade-long climb, because whichever timeline wins gets to define what the $4 billion is for. A count is one kind of number. Medicaid gives us another, the number a low-income family now has to produce every 6 months just to stay covered. This rule, issued at the start of June, requires certain Medicaid applicants and enrollees to show 80 hours a month of qualifying activity, work, certain work programs, community service, or half-time education, with states required to implement it no later than the 1st of January 2027 and to re-verify eligibility at least every 6 months or at renewal, with the option to check more often. The surface version is simple. It is about work. But what matters underneath is not work. It is proof. The question this rule actually asks is not whether low-income people work. Most of them do. It is whether they can survive the documentation machine built around proving it. Because the threshold is not the 80 hours. The threshold is everything behind the 80 hours, the eligibility logic, the verification workflows, the exemption processing, the renewal notices, the appeals, the call center scripts, the data matching, the reporting, and the churn prevention. A rule can sound clean at the podium and become operational risk the moment it touches the ground. And this is the part nobody frames out loud. A person can be working, eligible, and doing everything right, then still lose coverage because the notice went to the wrong address, the data match failed, or the hold time on the phone line outlasted their shift. That is coverage loss by friction. Eligible on paper, uninsured in practice. And it falls hardest on exactly the people with the least room to absorb a paperwork failure. The mechanism is instability. The moment coverage depends on recurring proof, eligibility stops being a status and becomes a treadmill. We have seen this in every program where verification quietly became the real eligibility test. The churn is not just a side effect, it becomes a budget outcome, whether or not anyone names it that way. So the evidence will show up in the operational numbers. Follow the churn rate, the share of eligible people who lose coverage for procedural reasons. Follow exemption processing times, renewal failure rates, call center wait times, and appeals volume. And follow the build clock, because states have roughly 7 months, and a rule that simple can break a process that was never built to carry this much proof this fast. From there, the read drops closer to the first phone call, where protection can be lost long before it is ever formally denied. Reporting out of Pennsylvania this week found that elder abuse agencies rejected cases experts said should have been investigated, while the state scaled back its daily oversight of what are called no-need designations, the label that can stop a deeper investigation before it starts, including home visits or a medical record review. The institutional language calls this case handling. The operating truth is intake classification. Protection can fail long before the word denial is ever used. A case does not have to be dramatically rejected. It can be marked low priority. It can be routed out. It can be labeled no need and become administratively invisible while the harm goes unexamined. This is where bureaucracy gets quiet, which is usually when people get hurt. The structure repeats under pressure. When a care system is told to classify, route, and close faster, the first label becomes the whole decision. And the first label is where bias, fatigue, and underfunding do their work unseen. So operators should follow the intake categories and who defines them. The oversight frequency, now that daily review has been scaled back, the reversal rates, the staffing levels, the hotline response times, and the share of cases screened out before investigation begins. Sometimes protection does not get denied. It gets named wrong before anyone looks. Classification is one gate, permitting is another, and it carries a longer memory. In Curtis Bay, a neighborhood in Baltimore, a fuel oil spill this week deepened an already raw fight with the petroleum recovery company that wants to expand. That company's prior site experienced a fatal fire in 2022 and was cited for pollution violations. And now it is seeking to install tanks at another location. Read quickly. This is one local fuel spill. The sharper read is permitting trust. The spill is the event. The permit is the signal. Curtis Bay residents are not reacting to a single incident. They are reacting to accumulated industrial exposure, delayed notice, prior harm, and the recurring experience of watching risk come back to their streets through official paperwork properly stamped and approved. The neighborhood remembers what the permitting file is allowed to forget. To a regulator, each incident is a discrete file, reviewed on its own merits. To the people who live there, it is one continuous story. The fire, the violations, the spill, the new tanks, all of it stacking. Environmental risk has memory, even when the review layer does not. One side counts incidents, the other side lives inside them. So the tell will be in the process. Follow the permit timeline, the structure of the public hearings, the environmental review, the community notice requirements, the proximity to homes and schools, and the enforcement history. Above all, follow whether cumulative exposure is treated as evidence or whether each incident gets to start the clock clean. The community is not only responding to what spilled onto the road, it is responding to how often risk is allowed to return with paperwork. From one neighborhood, widen the map. The U.S. State Department plans to cut the number of embassies and consulates in Africa that process visas from nearly 50 down to 20 hubs, which means applicants in the countries that lose their hub now have to travel much farther just to be processed. In the same window, the Council of the European Union reached a deal on return rules that would let member states set up return hubs in third countries for people with no right to stay. One frame is visa efficiency. The other is migration enforcement. The deeper read on both is the same. Movement is being governed through friction. The border does not have to close. The door can stay perfectly legal while the hallway to reach it gets longer, more expensive, and harder to survive. The door is still open, technically, and technically is doing a lot of work there. Picture it. The door is legal, and it is 400 miles away now, in another country, with the travel, the lodging, the lost wages, and a second trip if the paperwork is wrong. For a family with means, that is an inconvenience. For everyone else, the distance is the denial. Nobody said no. The map said it for them. The modern border is becoming a structure of distance, cost, transfer, and proof, rather than a single wall with a single gate. You no longer have to be turned away. You can be priced out, routed elsewhere, or handed to a third country. So follow who absorbs the burden. Which countries lose their visa hubs and how far their applicants now travel? Which third countries agree to become return destinations and on what terms? And the accountability after transfer. Because once a person is moved to a third country, what happens to them tends to leave the headline entirely. The state does not always close the border. Sometimes the map does the denial for it. Distance does not only govern people, it governs cost. The heads of four global institutions, the International Energy Agency, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank Group, and the World Trade Organization, issued a joint warning this week that the war in the Middle East is creating substantial and highly asymmetric impacts on energy, food security, and economic activity, and that the most vulnerable countries are being hit hardest through higher fuel and fertilizer prices, deeper uncertainty, and rising risk to jobs and livelihoods. On its face, a story about energy prices. Underneath, it is a story about who absorbs exposure. Fuel prices become food prices. Fertilizer costs become planting season risk. Shipping disruption becomes debt pressure. A country thousands of miles from the fighting can carry the economic damage as if it stood on the front line. Why does a war you are not part of show up at your fertilizer counter? Because cost does not stay where the conflict is. War travels through markets before it reaches policy language. The decisions may be made by states and armed actors. The costs travel through people who had no seat at the table. So follow the downstream. Fuel prices, fertilizer supply, and food inflation in import-dependent economies, debt distress and shipping lanes, and emergency financing from the global institutions, because that financing is the tell that the exposure has already moved from the battlefield into someone else's budget. Hold this one because it connects to the center of the week. One conflict, two structures. Here it moves through fuel and fertilizer. Next, it moves through something far more personal. Now we get to the center of the week, because this is where the gate stops looking like policy and starts looking like a vendor product. A major study this week, the largest of its kind, examined 3.4 million real job applicants, 4 million applications, 156 employers, and 11 market sectors, where every single application was scored by algorithms from one vendor. The researchers gave it a name worth keeping: algorithmic monoculture, and warned that this kind of monoculture can bottleneck opportunity across an entire market. The headline calls this AI bias in hiring. That is real, but it is not the whole read. What matters underneath is that this is labor market machinery. When you apply for jobs, you think you are applying to different employers, different logos, different portals, different job descriptions. But if the same vendor logic sits underneath all of them, a no in one place can become a no everywhere, repeated by the same engine wearing different brands. Colorado makes it sharper. The state just repealed and replaced its earlier AI law before the original one even took effect, putting a narrower framework in its place. One built around notice and after the fact disclosure, and stripping out the bigger obligations, the risk management programs, the impact assessments, the reasonable care duties. So the story is not the tidy one: hidden gate, then transparency arrives to fix it. The truth is harder. The hidden gate exists, and the legal structure built to govern it got narrowed before it ever took hold. Disclosure is not the same thing as accountability. It tells you there was a gate. It does not always tell you how the gate was built. And this is the one that should make every operator pause, because it reframes something we all carry. When you get rejected from a job, what is actually judging you? It feels like a verdict on you, your resume, your experience, your worth. But if one vendor's logic is doing the screening across a whole sector, That rejection is not 20 employers independently judging you. It is one system judging you once and echoing that judgment across every door you knock on. The rejection feels personal, the machinery is not. So the evidence is specific and it matters more than the disclosure language. Follow employer notice and whether adverse decision explanations actually explain anything. Follow audit standards and vendor concentration because concentration is the real risk. Follow human review rights and record retention. And follow the central question whether disclosure is being used as a substitute for accountability rather than a path to it, which is why I keep coming back to one line for this entire week. The future of discrimination may not look like one employer saying no. It may look like every employer using the same system to say no in a different font. That is not a forecast. With one vendor sitting underneath 3.4 million applications, that is the present, described plainly. The hiring engine is one private system doing public work. The final signal turns the same logic toward the battlefield. Reporting this week, drawn from a Pentagon letter, revealed that U.S. military personnel deployed in war zones have been targeted using commercially available location data. U.S. Central Command received threat reports of adversaries exploiting that commercial data to track and surveil U.S. personnel in theater. Lawmakers raised the same alarm, warning that foreign adversaries are using commercial location data to target service members in the Middle East and urging the Department of Defense to adopt safeguards, including disabling the advertising identifiers on smartphones. The public-facing language here is location privacy. Underneath that label, this is surveillance infrastructure. The same data economy built to track consumers, serve ads, and monetize attention is now being used to expose soldiers. The same phone behavior that helps sell you sneakers can expose where someone sleeps in a war zone. That is not a privacy nuisance. That is a security failure with the consumer interface. The data was sold to you as convenience and personalization. In a war zone, the exact same data becomes a targeting tool. The data did not change, the context did. This is the second half of the connection I flagged earlier. One conflict, two structures. In the global economy, it moves through fuel, fertilizer, shipping, and budgets. In the security environment, it moves through apps, advertising identifiers, brokered location data, and the commercial surveillance economy. Same war, different rails. So follow the seam between commerce and defense, advertising identifiers and brokered location data, military device policy and app permissions for deployed personnel, contractor data practices, and the regulatory drift, whether data rules begin migrating out of consumer privacy law and into defense policy, because that migration is the signal that the surveillance economy is finally being treated as national security exposure, not a consumer nuisance. In conflict, personalization becomes exposure. And that brings us to the institution built to question these gates, the newsroom. Treat this as a nod, not a detour. Scott Pelley's exit from 60 Minutes is not just a television story. It is a farewell to a form of journalism that still believed pressure, time, editing, and resistance were part of the public record. The newsroom is a gate too. It decides what gets investigated, what gets softened, what gets buried, and what gets protected long enough to reach the public. When that gate changes hands, the loss does not always show up immediately. It shows up later, in the question that is not asked, the investigation that is softened, or the story that needed someone willing to hold the line. A farewell is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a warning about what the institution is becoming without the people who knew how to resist the edit. So let me bring the week into one read. The through line is not that one hand moved every gate. The sharper point is that the same structure keeps appearing. In public policy, the gate leaves a signature, a rule, an order, a notice, a funding announcement. In private systems, the gate often leaves something harder to trace: a model, a vendor, a data broker, a screening engine, a permission buried inside an app. The gate that moves by policy leaves a signature. The gate that moves by private system does not. That is the asymmetry this week is teaching. We are getting better at watching the gates we can name, while more of them move behind systems that were never built to be watched. And if you carry only one signal out of this week, carry the hiring one. A person applies to 20 jobs, 20 logos, 20 portals, 20 rejections. Each one lands like a personal verdict, but underneath, it may be one vendor's logic saying no 20 times. The rejection feels personal. The cause is structural. That is the gate moving by private machinery in plain sight, wearing a different font each time you meet it. This week, track the gate and name who moved it. Sometimes it is an office and you can name it. Sometimes it is a private system no one signed for. Read both and trust the second one less. And that's the brief for this week. Good to be in the room with you. Until next time, this has been CR Change Request.